for those who are visiting or may not be familiar with what we're doing in Sojourners, we're going through the characters of the Bible, and we are on David for quite a while. And we have reached the period of David's life where he's fleeing from Saul, where he's in the wilderness. And some think that this may have been as long as 10 years. I know you read it in 1 Samuel, and it just seems like happening very quickly. But some have speculated, and it is speculation, that it may have been as long as a decade that David was fleeing from Saul before finally the Lord himself removes Saul. And David, who has been anointed to be his successor, is willing to wait, even though he's been anointed, even though the Spirit of God has come upon him and equipping him to be king. His attitude, as we saw back long ago in the middle of December, when we were looking at David in the wilderness, even 2 times he has an opportunity to kill Saul, and he does not. And I think the idea there is David says, he's the Lord's anointed. The Lord put him in that position, and I'm not going to take the liberty of removing him from that position. The Lord made him king. The Lord will have to remove him before I step in. And that's exactly what happened. Now, I want you to turn to 1 Samuel 22, and I want us to look today at In the Cave with Dave. In the Cave with Dave. Yes, turn it on, Will. Okay, well, technology, all right. In the Cave with Dave is our title, or Spelunking with Fugitives. And if you don't know what spelunking is, you will find out today as David spends some time in a cave with a rowdy bunch, a bunch of ne'er-do-wells, but a bunch who are like David, disenchanted with Saul, even fleeing from Saul, and they're hanging out together. And we see them in the cave. Now, this is not the only cave in David's fleeing from Saul. There's at least one, maybe more. There's the cave of En-Gedi, and we've already looked at that back in mid-December when David had the opportunity, when Saul was indisposed in an embarrassing situation at the front of the cave. That's the cave down at En-Gedi. This is a cave in the Judean wilderness, and I'm going to show you actual photographs of the cave. Well, maybe 99% sure that we can see where David was hanging out. The cave of Adullam. Would you follow me as I read 1 Samuel 22, verses 1 to 3, 1 and 2. David departed from there, that is, from being a self-imposed exile in Philistia. He departed from there and escaped to the cave of Adullam. And we're going to see a picture of that cave soon. Now watch, what happened to David's family? Well, the text tells us. When his brothers and all his father's house heard it, now where would his brothers be? In what town? Bethlehem, right. Yeah, David was from Bethlehem. When his fathers heard it, Bethlehem was not too far from the cave of Adullam. They went down there to him. Now, it may have been not only they were sympathetic to David, or because they were his brothers, but also there may have been a real threat to their own lives. And we're going to see evidence of that with what David does with his parents. So his brothers, remember, all these brothers were passed over earlier in favor of the young kid brother, David. Samuel goes down and says, I'm here to anoint one of your sons. And Jesse brings them in one by one. The oldest, nope. Second, nope. Third, nope. Fifth, fourth, nope. Fifth, nope. And Jesse must say, well, what's going on here? And the only ones left is a ruddy little brother out with the sheep. Bring him in, Samuel says. And little David comes in, and Samuel says, yep, that's the one. So these were brothers that had been passed over. We don't know if they had any feeling of sibling rivalry with their younger kid brother. But we do know that they joined him at the cave of Adullam. And everyone who was in distress, and everyone else who was in debt, and everyone who was bitter in soul, interesting, reading from the ESV, gathered to him, and he became captain over them, and they were with him about 400 men. That doesn't mean all 400 of them were in the cave. There's no caves in Israel except the stalactite caves, which hadn't been discovered yet, that could handle 400 men. But it just means that David was there and maybe his immediate entourage, and then camping around the cave were his brothers and others, about 400 men. Now, let's just talk a little bit about the cave itself. Now, I realize this map is very, very crowded, and it's hard to make any sense of. I'm fully aware of that. But there's a reason why I use this map that is very confusing, because it shows you how confusing and crazy life must have been for David when he was fleeing from Saul. It all began right up here where David began to flee. And these lines, which are going back and forth in a crazy way, it's hard to follow it, because that was what life was like for David over the next few years, going all over the wilderness of Judea, even going over into Philistia, even taking a time, as we're going to see in verses 3 and following, to take his parents from Bethlehem all the way over to Moab. But I do have red lines over the place called Adullam, which was where the cave was. Now let's look at the cave, which I think we can be about 99% sure that this was the cave where David was. We want to look at the cave, then we want to look at some of these companions, and then we want to close with looking at the concern in the cave and look at the 2 cave psalms. So that's where we're going today. Ready to go? All right, good. Now, this is where the cave of Adullam is. The cave is underneath those trees. Let me tell you, tour groups don't go here. As a matter of fact, I have never taken a tour group here. I have visited it on my own when I was in Israel. I had a few days, and I was looking at places where you don't normally go with a tour group. And so I found the cave of Adullam and have some pictures of it. So this is not a place where tour groups go. I've never heard of it as a stop on an Israel tour. But here it is, and here's a picture of the cave. Now, this is most probably the cave underneath those trees on that hill where David hid. Here's another view of it from another side. Obviously, later generations built up a wall and a door in front of the cave and lived there. But this is the best option for where David hung out. And let's go inside the cave with a few IBEX students. Abner, are you there? Abner taught for 2 years at IBEX. No, I don't think he's there. Here are some IBEX students. And obviously in the darkness of the cave, the photography is not good. But imagine David hanging out in there. Now, caves are not comfortable places. The students slept there overnight. They were glad when the sun came up in the morning. There are efforts like this when you hear about them. Oh, we're going to sleep in the cave of Adullam where David slept. And about 1 a.m., you're wishing you were back in your dorm room. I mean, and so there they are in the actual cave of Adullam. It adds some sort of personal touch to it when you see this, however. All right, so that's the cave. And let me turn this one back on. Let's look at his companions. We've already seen that his brothers join him, probably because of protection, but also they were sympathetic to David. And then others who were sympathetic to David start to join him as well. But it looks like old Jesse and Mrs. Jesse, mom and dad, are probably too old to become spelunking fugitives. And David realizes that Bethlehem is very, very close to where Saul has access. And you know what Saul could do? Saul could hold them hostage and say, David, I've got your mom and dad. You better turn yourself in. So the text says, verse 3, David went from there to Mizpah of Moab, and he said to the king of Moab, please let my father and my mother stay with you till I know what God will do for me. Interesting his view on providence. Until I know what God will do for me. He had confidence that God would take care of him, but he didn't have the details yet. That's interesting. And I think that's important in our own view of providence. Let's see what God will do here. Let's watch and see how God works this out. He has confidence enough to trust God, but he doesn't know exactly the details. Do you have that confidence? Do you have that trust? I don't know what God is going to do for me, but I'm going to trust him. Will I be captured by Saul? I don't know. I know God will take care of me, but I don't know the details. So could you watch over my mom and dad, elderly mom and dad, until I see what falls out with me? A wonderful trust in the providence of God. I think I may have mentioned this back in December, but if I did, John MacArthur never repeats anything, so every preacher repeats. So I may have mentioned this. Why did he take them to the king of Moab? Verse 4. They stayed with him all the time that David was in the stronghold. Well, remember, great-grandmama was a Moabite. Ruth was a Moabitess, and David no doubt said, Here's Jesse, the grandson of a Moabite lady who joined us years ago. Could you watch out for these kissing cousins for a while? Now, it's very interesting. They go off the scene, and nothing is mentioned about his parents. I'm going to guess, though I don't know for sure, that they may not have survived the 10 years of David wandering in the wilderness, fleeing from Saul, and maybe they had passed on by the time he became king. Again, when the Bible is silent, we need not speculate too much about that. So that's now watch. There's some other companions here. Notice verse 2. Everyone who was in distress, and everyone who was in debt, and I kept the D's here on my outline, and everyone who was discontented gathered to him. What a motley crew. Those who were in distress, those who were in debt, and those who were discontented with Saul and his leadership. So in addition to his brothers, family, there were people who were not happy with Saul. There were people who were threatened by Saul. There were people who identified with David, the successor to Saul. Saul was losing confidence in his leadership. We see this over and over when Saul wants something to be done. Not everybody agrees with him. We're going to even see this in this passage. So Saul had some people who were just fed up with his leadership. And David had some sympathizers in that regard. Those who were in distress, those who were in debt, and those who were discontented. And he became captain over them. And it ended up about 400 men. Now, I mentioned here some companions. The text does not mention them, but in 2 Samuel 23, there were some others of these leaders called David's mighty men. And while David was in the cave of Adullam with his mighty men, 2 Samuel 23 says that David said, "Oh, that I had a drink of water from the well of Bethlehem." And 3 guys fell over themselves, saying, "He wants some water from the well of Bethlehem. Let's go get some from there." But the problem is the Philistines were in control of Bethlehem at the time. And so they had to risk their lives going to get some water from the well of Bethlehem. Why? Because David wanted it. I'm up here and I say, "Oh, that I had a cup of coffee from the refreshment table." And 3 people are falling all over themselves, getting me a cup of coffee and also an apple fritter, which I never ask for, but never refuse. Anyway, apple fritters, one weakness that I have. I can still button the, after the cruise. Yeah, pretty good. So I gotta stick right. Anyway, I can't leave the mic. All right, good. What was I talking about? Apple fritters. Yeah, okay. David's drink. Thank you, Chris. David's drink of water. So, I'll just mention it now because it happened here at the cave of Adullam. Those guys went and risked their lives. They're fighting, killing. They get a bucket of water from the well of Bethlehem and they fight their way back through and they come down to the cave of Adullam and they give it to David and David goes, pours it out. Ungrateful wretch. No, not at all. No greater honor could have been given to those guys who risked their lives because he said, "I'm pouring it out before the Lord. You brought me something for me to selfishly satisfy my thirst with. I'm going to offer it to the Lord." No greater honor could be given to those guys who risked their lives than watching David pour it out before the Lord. Okay, that happened here as well, though it's not recorded in 1 Samuel 22, 2 Samuel 23, 13, and following. So that's the companions. Now there's let me just say that before. Here I'm going to get political. Here I'm going to get international. Here I'm going to get contemporary. Here I'm going to get in trouble. I don't think so. Let me tell you, there's time for regime change here. People are dissatisfied with Saul. They don't even do what Saul tells them to do. We're going to see a little bit later on that Saul unmercifully slaughters the priests at Nob for no more justification than they helped David as David was fleeing. And he ends up murdering them all. This is a murderous regime. It's time for regime change, and it looks like people are rising up in opposition to the regime. Let me tell you, there's a country in the Middle East that I think that's ripe for regime change. And I think if we knew what was going on in that country, we might be surprised that not everybody is marching in step with the Ayatollah. There's a lot of folks, among them Christians, who are being persecuted, and also Muslims who are sick and tired of it. If we only knew how many are there that would welcome regime change. Now, I've gotten political. I've gotten international. I won't spend a lot of time on it. But there's also something else here. This was a murderous regime. I'm going to get to that in just a minute. This was an antichrist regime. I'm going to get to that in a minute. And maybe that's what's happening in the Middle East And there's other countries that are ripe for a regime change. I don't know exactly how we are going to address that. It's not my business to know or to dictate, but it can happen. History, I think, is repeating itself. Now, let's look a little bit more at that. Notice who joins David here. It's easy to overlook this, but you shouldn't. Look at, please, verse 5. Yes. Then the prophet Gad said to David, "Do not remain in the stronghold, depart and go into the land of Judah." So David departed and went into the forest of Hereth. And then, of course, he comes back to Adullam later on. Gad. Now, who was Gad? Gad was a prophet. It's easy to overlook this, folks. There are no prophets ministering to Saul because he doesn't want them. My message first Sunday in February, if these guys will let me have the pulpit back, in February, will be on Saul and how no prophet would speak to him. No prophet was giving any advice to Saul because prophets were persona non grata in the palace. You know, one of the roles of a prophet is a guardian and a watchman over the monarchy. It's easy to forget that. Oftentimes you will see a prophet being very close to a king like a spiritual advisor, almost like a chaplain. And David had those, and Hezekiah had Isaiah. There were other prophets who would attach themselves to the king to call the king to obedience and to give the king advice. There were no prophets in Saul's kingdom. He didn't want any. As a matter of fact, God stopped speaking to him through prophets, and that led to Saul's depression and eventually him going to visit the woman of Endor because no prophet was speaking to them, because prophets were not allowed. They were not welcome. Here a prophet comes and attaches himself to David. And David benefited and was called on the account by prophets, Gad and Nathan. Nathan is the one through whom the Davidic covenant is given. Nathan is the one who said to David after his sin, "You are that man." He called him to account. It's important that a king have a prophet, his chaplain, and listen to him. David has a chaplain. But not only that, he has a priest. Look at verse 20. But one of the sons of Ahimelech, son of Ahitub, named Abiathar, escaped and fled after David. Abiathar told David that Saul had killed the priests of the Lord. We'll talk about that. And David said to Abiathar, "I knew on that day when Doeg the Edomite was there that he would surely tell Saul, 'I have occasioned the death of all the persons of your father's house. Stay with me.'" He asks the priest to stay with him. "Do not be afraid, for he who seeks my life seeks your life. With me you shall be in safekeeping." So here's David, the anointed king, joined by Gad, the anointed prophet, joined by Abiathar, the anointed priest. Does that sound familiar to you? Prophet, priest, king. The three anointed ones, king, priest, and prophet, are together. You can see what God is doing here. He's preparing David for eventually to be the king, the anointed priest, and the anointed prophet. How appropriate that those are the three titles of the anointed Messiah, the prophet, priest, king, who will unite in his very ministry. All three of these, prophet, priest, and king. Here is a picture of the coming Messiah as well. Now, if there's a picture of the Christ, how appropriate, there's also a picture of Antichrist here. Because what is Saul doing? Saul is continuing his murderous reign. We won't read it, but in verses 6 through 19, before Abiathar shows up, Abiathar escapes from a murderous destruction of all the priests. Remember when David was fleeing from Saul, one of the first things he did was he stopped by the priests at Nob and they gave him some food. And then he went on. Saul found out that those priests had given David food. And he ends up murdering the entire priests. And Abiathar escapes and joins David. A murderous antichrist is at hand, while the picture of the true Christ is emerging in David with prophet, priest, and king. And here's this murderous. And how appropriate that as we see prophetically, what will Antichrist do? He will have a murderous regime. He will persecute the true people of God. So here we have emerging in this Old Testament series of events, Christ and Antichrist, the true anointed king and the false Antichrist king Saul. What an amazing picture to be displayed before us here. So that's David's companions. And since the Scotsman preached a short message this morning and let us out at 10 of, you know what pressure that brings on me? I just hope they had some extra songs and special music so the Scotsman can go till 12. I remember the first time I preached at Grace Community Church in June of 1997. I preached on Ezekiel 1, and I let the congregation out at 5 of 12. A colleague of mine by the name of Greg Fraser said, "Varner, you committed 2 unpardonable sins when you preached at Grace Church yesterday." I said, "What's that?" He said, "You preached from the Old Testament, and 2, you let us out early." You remember that, Greg? Yeah. Well, the Scotsman committed an unpardonable sin, bringing pressure upon me. Well, I want to tell you, my friends, I've been to Australia, and we're going to preach till 12. All right, so now, but to do that, we've got to look at the third thing, the concern. Now, there are 2 psalms that are called cave psalms. Turn, please, to Psalm 57. Now, how are they called cave psalms? The psalm title mentions that. Please turn to Psalm 57. Don't depend on your cell phone. It may run out of power. What will you do if it runs out of power? Look at Psalm 57. And I want you to notice, first of all, the psalm title. To the choir master, according to Do Not Destroy, a miktam of David when he fled from Saul in the cave. In a few minutes, we're going to look at Psalm 142, which is also a cave psalm, where the psalm title says, when David was in a cave. Now, we're not sure that this was the cave of Adullam. It may have been. I think it was. But out of the experience of being in this cave, fleeing from Saul, David wrote this psalm, and also Psalm 142, as we're going to see in a minute. Now, here are some main things that I want you to notice in this psalm, because here's where the message of David and what happened to him has application for us all. Notice how he refers to my soul twice in verses 1 and 4. Be merciful to me, O my God. Be merciful for me, for in you my soul takes refuge. Look at verse 4. My soul is in the midst of lions. I lie down amid fiery beasts, the children of man, whose teeth are spears and arrows, whose tongues are sharp swords. Those are his enemies in Saul's court. And he's in this real period of distress. And he's looking for refuge. We're going to see this particularly in Psalm 142, where David speaks about having no refuge at all, even in the cave. So he's saying, be merciful to me, O God. And he says twice to God, be exalted. Verse 5, be exalted, O God, above the heavens. Let your glory be over the earth. And then he ends the psalm, verse 11. Be exalted, O God, above the heavens. Let your glory be over all the earth. This refrain is in the middle of the psalm, verse 5, and then at the end of the psalm, and it pulls it all together. David is in the cave. A price is on his head. His life is in danger. He knows that the guys who are joining him are putting their lives in danger too. And while his trust is in the providence of God, remember what he says, watch after my parents until I see what God does for me. He doesn't know the details yet. He doesn't know how this is going to end up. Is he going to be captured? He doesn't know. So in the midst of this cave experience, he cries out to God and writes these two psalms. Notice verse 8. I'll skip down to verse 8 and then come back. Awake, my glory. Awake, O harp and lyre. I will awake the dawn. Now, this is a poetic language. By addressing something as inanimate as a harp, he was saying, play harp, play lyre. Awake my glory, which is my soul. I will awake the dawn. Notice, awake, O harp. That's where I got the title for this. Yes. Awake, O harp. O harp. I played that. Now, it probably was not, what's her name's harp? Suzanne John's harp. Can you imagine bringing that thing around for 10 years? Bringing it into the cave of Adullam? It was probably this right here. Probably this right here. A handheld lyre. Maybe David had it with him. Maybe David had it with him. And in the midst of the pain of isolation and suffering physically and emotionally, awake, O harp, play the music of Yahweh. Be exalted, O God. Let your glory be over all the earth. Now, there's two more things that go together here, and I've got them there. Chesed and emet. Those are two Hebrew words that you've got to memorize. I know Norm told me one time, Will, I know a little Hebrew. I said, you do? He said, yeah, he's my tailor in Santa Clarita. I said, no, Norm, that's not the Hebrew that I'm talking about here. It's chesed and emet. Now, if you say it like that, just make sure somebody's not in front of you. Chesed and emet. And it is translated steadfast love and faithfulness at the end of verse 3. And it's also translated steadfast love and faithfulness in verse 10. Now, these are two very rich words. And the interesting thing is, every version has them translated differently. The New American Standard loves the word loving kindness and truth, loving kindness and faithfulness. The thing is, almost every version translates them differently because we don't know exactly what these words mean as a specific translation, but we know what they mean in their theology. Faithful love is another. Notice in verse 10, there's parallelism here. Your steadfast love is great to the heavens. Your faithfulness reaches to the clouds. Poetic language. The second line restates the first line. Same thing also throughout the psalm of the second line repeating the first line in different words. I don't want to throw too many technical terms at you, but this could be a doublet, and it means something like faithful love. Now, this expression that appears twice, chesed and emet, steadfast love and faithfulness, appears together as a pair over 25 times in the Psalms. I wrote at the end of my commentary what I've learned. The prominent role of Exodus 34:6 as the theme text for the Psalms doctrine of God. If you look back at Exodus 34:6, it's Yahweh revealing himself to Moses, and he says, my name is Chesed and Emet. My name is steadfast love and faithfulness. And that goes throughout the Psalms. In that passage, God's attributes, especially his chesed, provides the theological framework for the psalmist's observations both about God and his world. The combination of chesed and emet is also quite powerful throughout the Psalms 25 times. Some have even thought that maybe John 1:14 is an allusion to it, that Jesus was full of grace and truth. What it really boils down to is this. You got problems, people? You got challenges in your life? What's your answer? Another sermon on 10 points on how to live the Christian life? We've all heard sermons like that. You don't need another sermon on how to live the Christian life. What you need is to understand the chesed and emet of the Lord. The reason it's permeating the Psalms is that the psalmists were overwhelmed and captured by the greatness and the attributes of God. I remember one time there was this guy going around giving seminars on how to live the Christian life. 40 hours of lectures on how to live the Christian life. 6 steps to do this, 10 steps to do that, 12 steps to do this, 13 steps to do this, 8 steps to do this. By the end, we had lists of things, and I wondered, how can I live the Christian life? I might forget step 4 out of 6. What will I do if I forget step 4? All that is good, but you know what? The psalmist said, oh Lord, it's your steadfast love and your faithfulness. The psalmists were consumed with the glory of God. The psalmists were consumed with the attributes of God. The psalmist would say, what's the solution to living the life? It's knowing God and being so dominated and controlled by his awesomeness. Don't tell me my sermon was awesome. Only one is awesome. The one who inspires awe. That's the secret. Give a sermon, of course. Tell us some steps. It's okay. But really, it's not just one more sermon on how to take 5 steps to holiness. Be consumed with the greatness, the glory, the attributes, the steadfast love, the faithfulness of God, and somehow your life will fall into place. So you're in the cave with Dave. You know what dominated him in that rocky, using a rock for a pillow? Yes, it was a refuge, but it wasn't comfortable. And the weeks went on to months, and the months went on to years. How do you survive being in the cave with Dave? How do you survive? Become entranced with the glory and the majesty and the goodness and the holiness and the love of God. Study God's attributes, and everything will start to fall into place. That's how important the Psalms are. Hey, I'm not letting you out yet. 142. Psalm 142. Notice the psalm title. Psalm 142. a maskil of David when he was in the cave. Second cave psalm, a prayer. With my voice I cry out to the Lord. With my voice I plead for mercy to the Lord. I pour out my complaint before him. I left my trouble before him. You know what I love about the Psalms? You got a year? I'll tell you what I love about the Psalms. One of the things I love about the Psalms is that they're so stinking honest. They are so honest. The psalmist is not some super spiritual guy who never has a struggle. How do I identify with a saint? You know, a Roman Catholic saint, they're perfect. How do I identify with them? Saints don't understand my struggles, but the psalmists were no plastic saints. They were real people, and they struggled, and David struggled, and they even had doubts. And they even questioned. They sometimes said, "Oh, Lord, how long?" And sometimes they even said, "Oh, Lord, why?" Don't you ever question God? Psalmists are questioning God all the time. That's what is so real about them. The Psalms are dug into life as it is. Not written by some super spiritual saints in an ivory tower someplace, but are written by people living in caves. But the wonderful thing about them is that they don't stop with the agony. They don't stop with the laments. They keep going, but they're wrestling with God and his ways. Verse 3, when my spirit faints within me, you know my way, and the path where I walk, they've hidden a trap for me. Look to the right and see, there's none who takes notice of me. No refuge remains to me. No one cares for my soul. What do you mean? You got the refuge of the cave. Think about it, people. Did you see that cave? A cave can be a place of safety. A cave can be a very dangerous place. When you're trapped in the cave, no way out. So it's interesting. Yeah, it's a refuge, but it's not a refuge. When you're attacked, there's no way out. So David is experiencing that. He says, no refuge remains to me. They find out where the cave is, they'll easily flush me out. You ever feel backed up like that? No way out. No way out of this circumstance that I'm in. And Lord, you allowed me to get into this, and now I don't have any way out. What am I going to do now? If I ask for you to raise your hand, if you've ever wondered that, you might be hesitant because Christians don't struggle like that. Really? They don't? Yeah, raise your hand. It's okay. Okay. Because David wrestled with that, and the psalmist wrestled with that. They said, why? I don't have no refuge. But they kept praying, and they worked through it, because look at the next verse 5. I cry to you, O Lord, you are my refuge. The cave is not my refuge. You are my refuge. My portion in the land of the living. Verse 6, attend to my cry, for I am brought very low. Deliver me from my persecutors. Boy, David, for they are too strong for me. Bring me out of prison that I may give thanks to your name. The righteous will surround me, for you will deal bountifully with me. You read the first part of this psalm right through verse 6, you say, man, this guy's he's in a problem. He's in a bad state. Hey, just like some of us. But the lament psalms always have a pivot where they turn positive. And your life in the cave can have a pivot too. You might say, no refuge remains for me. How long is this going to happen? But then you say, bring me out of prison, Lord, in your time, that I may give thanks to you. You will deal bountifully with me. Dear person, dear child of God, if you're in a cave and you're struggling and you're doubting and you're wondering if you've got any real spiritual friends, just keep praying and keep trusting. The light will come into that cave, and you'll end up saying, you will deal bountifully with me. You say, but you don't understand my situation. I don't need to understand your situation. The psalmist does. I don't need to know the details of yours. Well, you wouldn't say that if you knew my... There it is. Give him a call. David, I don't have to understand your situation. It's all here. It's all here. It's your job to find it and see how David and the psalmist worked through this, and the light dawned in the cave at the end. And only if you've been through that can you really know what I'm talking about. Don't give up, child of God. There's light coming into the cave. Just keep trusting. His chesed and his emet, however you translate it. His steadfast love, his faithfulness. Maybe physically. I'm looking at people and I don't even want to look in the eye because you think I'm picking on you. I know you've got physical problems. I know that. I'm looking at others who've lost a spouse. And you feel like sometimes life is at an end. How can I face the next day? Refuge fails me. No man cares for my soul. God is my refuge. God is my refuge. So don't you give up. There's light coming into the cave. It's all here. It's all here. It's all here. No refuge? You are my refuge. I think the best thing is just recite Scripture with me, okay? Stand, please. Let's recite the Scripture together. This will be our closing prayer and affirmation, and may it be in your life, dear one. Together, God is our refuge and strength, a very present help in trouble. Therefore we will not fear, though the earth gives way, though the mountains be moved into the heart of the sea. Be still and know that I am God. I will be exalted among the nations. I will be exalted in the earth. The Lord of hosts is with us. The God of Jacob is our refuge. Let's do it again. God is our refuge and strength, a very present help in trouble. Therefore we will not fear, though the earth gives way, though the mountains be moved into the heart of the sea. Be still and know that I am God. I will be exalted among the nations. I will be exalted in the earth. The Lord of hosts is with us. The God of Jacob is our refuge. May the Lord bless you and keep you. May the Lord make his face to shine upon you and be gracious unto you. May the Lord lift up his countenance upon you and give you peace. In the name of Jesus, our Messiah, all God's people said, Amen.